You see, something's going to happen.
What? What's going to happen?
Something wonderful.
What?
I understand how you feel. You see, it's all very clear to me now.
Welcome back to the Occult Rejects and part 2 of Sacred Spaces, Architecture, Cosmos, and the Human Mind. In part 1, we stripped sacred geometry down to what it actually is when you remove the YouTube numerology and pi worship. We watched it emerge as a builder's language, ratios, grids, axes, orientation, then as a priest's language, thresholds, processions, directions, timed light, and then as a civilization scale obsession, Stone Age solstices, Egyptian alignment rituals, Mesopotamian cosmic mountains, Hindu mandala grids, Buddhist worlds you circle and climb, Feng Shui as landscape physics, Greek harmony as moral truth, early Christian Easting as theology, Islamic pattern as unity made visible, and Judaism's sacred geometry relocating into direction, text, boundary, and measured holiness. And if part 1 proved anything, its sacred geometry isn't one secret symbol. It's a reoccurring human strategy, a way of turning the invisible into something the body can't ignore. Now, part 2 is where it goes deeper, removing from the ancient world shared patterns into 3 territories people argue about: modern religions, esoteric overlays, and hard science. First, we're going to hit a run of traditions that prove sacred geometry didn't end in the medieval period. It kept evolving. Sikhism, where sanctity is inseparable from hospitality and the geometry of gathering. Jainism, where symmetry isn't aesthetic, it's metaphysics made of stone, a precision so intricate it feels like mathematics turned into devotion. The Bahai faith, where 9 sides become a sermon of unity. Latter-day Saint temples, where modern sacred architecture returns to cosmic diagrams, celestial order, ascent, and coded space built for ritual transformation. Then we step into the Gothic cathedral, not as a secret code machine, but as a theology turned into engineering, light as doctrine, height as awe, proportion as prayer. And we'll follow the thread into the Renaissance revival, where humanism, number, and divine order gets fused into a new architectural philosophy. Part theology, part mathematics, part political power. But the real pivot is, what happens when sacred architecture becomes esoteric architecture? Like late antique theurgy to Renaissance magic. Buildings designed not just to symbolize heaven, but to invoke it. Freemasonry and the Temple of Solomon, the Lodge Room as a portable cosmogram, geometry as moral initiation. Rosicrucians and the Golden Dawn, ritual spaces laid out like celestial maps and inner nervous systems, microcosms built to train the operator. Rudolf Steiner's anthroposophy and organic geometry, architecture as spiritual biology. Swedenborgian correspondences, space as a coded mirror of invisible worlds. And then, because we don't do this show like it's 1890, we bring in the modern laboratory. But the question under all of this, the question people feel but rarely say out loud, is what do these spaces actually do to us? Not philosophically, not symbolically, physiologically. Neuroarchitecture and environmental psychology suggest built space can modulate stress, attention, memory, emotion, even social behavior. Ceiling height and enclosure shape cognition. Cathedral mode versus cell mode. Curves and beauty hit reward systems. Symmetry and pattern engage the brain's hunger for order. Sound and reverberation can shift arousal and group coherence. Fractals and ornament may function like medicine, ordered complexity that calms without boring. Light becomes rhythm, mood, and the sudden moment of hierophany, the feeling that something broke through. And that's where part 2 comes in. Sacred geometry isn't only what a culture believes about shapes, it's also how shapes steer brains. Ritual space and the body become one system. Geometry as choreography, architecture as a nervous system instrument. So here's the deal for part 2. The symbolism. Because humans are meaning-making animals and sacred buildings are meaning machines, the occult overlays, because they reveal how intensely people want architecture to be an interface to the invisible, and the science, because if these spaces reliably produce awe, calm, fear, unity, submission, transcendence, then that effect has a mechanism, and mechanisms matter. But we're not doing the lazy everything is a code. We're doing the grown-up version. History, esotericism, and neuroscience in the same room, and we're going to see what survives. And this time, we're not just asking what sacred geometry means. We're asking what it does. So with all that in mind, If part 1 showed us the ancient grammar of sacred geometry, and part 2 is asking what these spaces do, then the next step is to watch sacred design evolve in traditions that are relatively modern in historical terms, but just as intentional on how they shape bodies, crowds, and consciousness. Because here's the mistake people make. They assume sacred geometry peaked with pyramids and cathedrals, and everything after that is just architecture. But that's not how religion works. Newer traditions inherit old instincts, orientation, symmetry, thresholds, procession, light, and then they reforge them around new theology and new social priorities. And that's exactly why Sikhism is such a powerful place to begin part 2. Because in Sikh sacred space, geometry isn't primarily about hiding codes in stone or freezing a cosmic diagram in a floor plan. It's about sanctity expressed through gathering, through openness, equality, circulation, and hospitality. Sikhism builds sacred space to bring the ordinary into the holy without humiliation, without hierarchy, without gates that tell you you're less than human. So we're going to start with a tradition where the architecture teaches you the doctrine before anyone speaks a word. The geometry of Sangat, the congregation as a living sacred body, and the langar, the communal kitchen as a ritual technology of equality. The Sikh faith, founded in the 15th century in Punjab, developed its own sacred architectural forms for gurdwaras, Sikh temples. The most famous is the Hamdardar Sahib Golden Temple in Amritsar, India, a masterpiece of sacred design infused with symbolic geometry. The Golden Temple sits at the center of a large square water tank, which is itself a perfect geometric pool, accessible by a causeway from the shoreline. Uniquely, the temple has 4 doors facing all cardinal directions, a deliberate design choice by Guru Arjan, who built it, to signify that people from all directions, all castes, creeds, and walks of life are welcome. This openness is a key Sikh principle. The Gurdwara is open to all humanity. Geometrically, 4 doors at 90 degrees intervals create a balanced cross-access plan, emphasizing inclusivity and balance. The Golden Temple sanctum is roughly square in plan, sitting on a square marble platform in the water. It is crowned by a stunning golden dome that is shaped like an inverted lotus, a hemispherical dome with elongated shape. The lotus shape in architecture often symbolizes spiritual blossoming and the divine realm manifesting in the material. The central pool, reflective and open to the sky, combined with the square temple and circular-ish dome, lotus, again gives us the union of circle and square, water and earth, heaven and humanity. Devotees circumambulate the tank on a wide marble walkway that forms a large rectangle around the water. A parikrama path akin to those in Hindu or Buddhist sites. But here water forms the inner shrine around which one walks until reaching the causeway to enter the Golden Temple itself. Another aspect of Sikh architecture is symmetry and proportionality that often follow classical canons. Many gurdwaras feature a square or octagonal base and multiple chhatris, domed kiosks, at their corners. The number of certain elements can be meaningful. Like older gurdwaras might have 4 corner chhatris or 8, symmetry guiding both aesthetics and structure. The Darbar Sahib, main hall, inside is usually centrally oriented. In some gurdwaras, the layout of the complex might consciously reflect a charbagh, Persian-style 4-part garden, integrating the Islamic Mughal influences of the region, as seen in the garden parterres around the Golden Temple complex. Crucially, Sikh architecture did not develop an extensive symbolic geometry treatise like Vastu Shastra, but it pragmatically adopted and reinterpreted the forms available in North Indian architecture, which was a blend of Hindu and Islamic styles, to serve Sikh ideals. The Sarovar, pool, around a temple is something seen in Hindu temples too, but making the shrine literally in the center of the water was unique. It perhaps symbolizes purity and the nectar of immortality. The pool's name means pool of nectar. It also practically and symbolically lowers the temple. One must descend steps from ground level to reach the water and causeway, unlike typical temples on high plains. This could signify humility, an important virtue in Sikhism. In fact, the Golden Temple's floor is lower than the surrounding city so that the devotees step down into the sacred space, metaphorically leaving worldly ego above. Many other historical gurdwaras, like the Anandpur Sahib and Patna Sahib, have similar layouts: a prominent dome, multiple smaller domes, a generally symmetric form, often with a square plan, and often situating in a compound with a sarovar or courtyard. Modern gurdwaras worldwide also follow a loosely defined geometry. usually a cuboid main hall, sometimes with octagonal elements, topped by one or more domes, most often fluted onion domes derived from subcontinental tradition, and the Nishan Shahib flagpole in the front, which is a tall vertical axis in itself, not unlike a yasti or a church steeple in its declarative verticality. In essence, Sikh sacred architecture merges the geometric language of preceding Indian architectures with Sikh values of openness, equality, and remembrance of God. The four-direction orientation of doors is a direct geometric expression of a spiritual ethos. The Sarovar's perfect square plan reflects a mandala-like completeness, with water symbolizing the infinite. The central dome's lotus geometry points to spiritual attainment. These elements create a space that is profoundly calming and elevating. Pilgrims often describe the Golden Temple complex as having a harmonious geometry that brings peace to the mind. The vast horizontal expanse of water and plaza, punctuated by rhythmic symmetry of the temple and its golden reflections, indeed can induce a meditative state. In terms of neuroscience, one might suspect such symmetry and natural elements foster stress reduction, aligning with modern studies on fractals and well-being, which we'll discuss later. Certainly, the design achieves what sacred geometry often inspires to, embodying a sense of cosmic order and welcome, making the divine principle palpable in spatial form. And now on to Jainism or Jainism. I've heard it said in multiple ways. Jainism, an ancient religion of India, has contributed some of the most delicately ornate and geometrically complex sacred architecture in the world. Jain temples, especially those of the medieval period, 11th to 15th centuries, are marvels of symmetry and detail. The famed Dewara temples on Mount Abu, for instance, are carved entirely in white marble with an almost obsessive pursuit of geometric perfection in their dome and ceilings. One looks up at the Dewara domes and see concentric rings of sculpted lotus petals, geometric rosettes, and rotating circles of deities. It's like gazing into a stone mandala. These ceilings often have diminishing concentric patterns, a bit fractal-like, culminating in a central pendant or lotus bud. The visual effect is of looking into the cosmos, each ring representing a higher heavenly realm in Jain cosmology. Jain cosmology itself is highly geometric. The universe is described as having a shape, often compared to a cosmic man or a divided column. And Mount Meru also features in Jain maps of the cosmos. The temple, as a microcosm, contains these ideas. Many Jain temples use the mandala's plan similar to Hindu temples, since culturally and historically they share architectural grammar. A notable feature is the Mula Prasada main shrine, often surrounded by multiple smaller shrine chambers, arranged symmetrically. In some cases, Jain temples are built as chaumukha, four-faced temples, meaning the main deity faces four directions in four separate sanctums, often under one spire, so that devotees can approach from any side. A famous example is the Adinatha temple of Ranakpur from 15th century. It's designed as a chaumukha on a cruciform plan with four entry points. The temple has 29 halls and 1,444 pillars arranged in such a way that from the center one gets a stunning vista of columns in perfect rows. But no two pillars are carved exactly alike. This is a wonderful blend of symmetry and variety. Geometrically, the layout is rigorously symmetric. Artistically, the micro details vary, perhaps to convey the Jain idea of unity in diversity and the inexhaustible creativity of reality. The effect on a visitor is often overwhelming beauty, an impression of entering a highly ordered, infinite space. In fact, the profusion of pillars and their arrangement yields a kind of visual fractal. Wherever you stand, pillars lined up in repetitive patterns, but there's always a pillar beyond, so the vista seems endless. Jain temples also frequently incorporate cosmological diagrams in their decoration. For example, depictions of the Samavasarana show concentric circular terraces. Sometimes these are echoed in the circular arrangements of certain temple elements. The use of the swastika is common in Jain temples, often displayed on the threshold or as a motif, representing the four states of existence. The swastika is itself a geometric figure that implies rotational symmetry and stability. In southern India, the Jain Basadis temples at Shravanabelagola and other sites followed local Dravidian style with some differences. Often simpler exteriors but highly polished symmetric interiors. The Gomateshvara statue, a 17-meter tall naked stone monolith of Bahubali, stands on a hilltop from 983 CE, While not a building, its proportions and placement are symbolically geometric. The statue is frontal, perfectly balanced, facing north, with an anthill and creepers carved symmetrically up his legs to symbolize his meditation stillness while vines grew. The idea of axial symmetry in human form is utilized as a statement of inner equilibrium. Overall, Jain's sacred architecture expresses a quest for purity and transcendence through intricate geometry. The extreme delicacy and repetition in ornament can be seen as a physical mantra. Focusing the devotee's mind on intricate patterns may aid in concentration and detachment from gross worldly thoughts. The fractal-like complexity, especially, resonates with modern observations. Fractal patterns in architecture, like repeating arches or concentric decorations, can induce a sense of calm and lower stress. It's fascinating what modern neuroarchitecture finds soothing. A moderate level of complexity and self-similarity was intuitively utilized by artisans centuries ago to create an atmosphere of sanctity. Thus, Jain temples stand as another variant of sacred geometry's power, where Hindus built massive cosmic mountains and Buddhists built meditative mandalas. Jains built jewel box universes in marble, human-scaled yet limitless in detail, aiming to reflect the order of the cosmos and the path to liberation. As an architectural parallel to Jain philosophy, one could say the rigorous symmetry equals the unchanging truth, or soul, and the lavish detail equal the manifold phenomena, but both integrated harmoniously. Now, next on to the Bahai. The Bahai faith, founded in 19th century Persia, has a small number of temples around the world, one per continent historically, known as houses of worship. Despite being modern structures, the 21st century, they adhere to a remarkable architectural principle. Every Bahai house of worship is 9-sided with 9 entrances. The number 9 has been special significance in Bahai belief. It symbolizes unity and completeness. 9 is the highest single-digit number, and in Arabic Abjad numerology, the word Baha, glory, equals 9. Bahai temples have 9 sides, which symbolizes that everyone is welcome to come in and pray, regardless of what religious direction they come from. In other words, the 9 entrances opening in all directions signify an openness to all peoples and all spiritual paths, reflecting the Bahai teaching of the unity of religions and humanity. Just as the Sikh Golden Temples has 4 doors for the 4 cardinal directions, the Bahai temples extend that inclusivity to 9, a number often used to represent all, since it contains 3 sets of trinities, and so on. The architectural styles of Bahai temples vary by location, but they consistently incorporate geometric symbolism. The Lotus Temple in New Delhi in 1986 is shaped like a giant white lotus flower with 27 petals arranged in clusters of 3 to form 9 sides. A brilliant fusion of organic form and geometric order. The lotus, aside from being culturally appropriate for India, is a symmetric radial form embodying purity. The temple sits on a 9-sided platform amid pools, giving the sense of a lotus floating on water. At night, it's lit and appears as a glowing geometric flower. Many find a spiritual power in the sheer harmony of its design. Another example, the Bahai House of Worship in Wilmette, Illinois, completed in 1953, has a circular decagonal dome with intricate lace-like ornament. The ornament, done in cast concrete, interweaves a 9-pointed star motif repeatedly. A 9-pointed star is an informal symbol of the faith, and indeed from above the temple forms a star. Each of its 9 entrances has a pillar and arc, and there's a rhythmic symmetry as you go around. Inside, the space is circular with the dome soaring overhead, suffused with light from geometric pattern of cleristy. The overall design by architect Louis Bourgeois was meant to unify elements from many religions: Greco-Roman columns, Gothic arches, Islamic arabesques, and so on, integrated in one design, which itself is a Bahai principle. All religions come from one source. The unity of geometric styles mirrors unity of faith. Recently, new Bahai temples continue the 9-sided plan, but in innovative ways. The Chile temple has 9 translucent marble and glass wings that together form a circular structure. From above, it resembles a 9-petaled flower. When sunlight hits it, the whole temple glows. At its center beneath the dome is a prayer hall for people of all backgrounds to sit in quiet prayer. The geometry here is more fluid, but still clearly 9-fold radial symmetry. In Bahai writings, there is mention that the houses of worship should have a 9-sided shape, and that the building itself is a dawning place of the mention of God. The 9-sided form, encircled usually by gardens, creates a non-hierarchical sacred space. All sides are equal. There is no front or back. This equality in geometry translates to an egalitarian space where no clergy presides, and any person of any religion can come to meditate. There are no ritual services per se, only collective prayer meetings with scriptures of all faiths read, a radically inclusive practice. Thus, the sacred geometry directly facilitates the faith's inclusive worship style. In essence, Bahai sacred architecture uses modern materials and engineering but stays rooted in a simple geometric mandate that carries rich symbolism. The 9-pointed star and nonogram as emblems of unity, completeness, and openness. The effect on visitors is often described as uplifting and unifying. There is a subtle psychological effect to radial symmetry. It draws all focus to the center equally from all sides. In a Bahai temple, this can remind worshippers that regardless of where they come from, they meet in the center in the light of the one God. Again, geometry becomes not just an aesthetic, but a teaching. Even without words, the form of the building says, "We are one." And now at the Latter-day Saints, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the LDS, founded in the 19th century in America, also created a new sacred architectural tradition, the Mormon Temple. These are not regular meeting houses, but special temples for ordinances, and they are rich in symbolic architecture. Early Mormon leaders were very conscious of temple symbolism, drawing from Solomon's temple and their own revelations. The Nuevo Temple, built in Illinois' 1840s, and the Salt Lake Temple, built in 1853 to 1893 in Utah, were the pioneer examples. They incorporated explicit symbols, carved stones of the sun, moon, and stars on their interior, all aligned in a vertical progression on the walls. For instance, on the Salt Lake Temple's granite facade, the lower buttresses feature moonstones in various phases. Above them are sun faces, and at the top are star stones. This reflects a theological concept of degrees of glory, telestial, terrestrial, celestial, which Joseph Smith taught, as well as a general motif of heaven and earth. The arrangement is not random. As noted by LDS commentators, the sequence of lunar phases were arranged to represent a full year, 50 moon phases around the temple, with the key month, April, when the church was founded, and also Passover and Easter season, at the center east tower. This suggests a cosmogram of time laid onto the building. The inscription, "I am Alpha and Omega," on the Salt Lake Temple further ties into the idea of God encompassing all time. And interestingly, the building itself, with the moon cycle, spans a symbolic year from Alpha to Omega. Salt Lake Temple's floor plan is a peculiar fusion of functional rooms and symbolic layout. It's roughly oriented eastward, with the prominent towers on the east end. Like medieval cathedrals, it has a strong east-west axis, and the outside resembles a fortress-like rectangle with 6 spires. But inside, the sequence of rooms, for ordinance ceremonies, moves upward both physically and symbolically, from lower-level rooms representing the world to higher-level rooms representing heaven. The pinnacle is the celestial room, a beautiful space meant to suggest heaven, often with a dome or high ceiling and opulent decor. In Salt Lake, this progression isn't aligned like a straight line but vertically stacked somewhat. Yet the concept is there, an ascension through spaces. Modern LDS temples continue to use symbolism, though often more internally. However, exterior geometry still matters. Many temples are built with 4 corner towers or 4 sides of equal design, implying stability and looking to the 4 quarters of the earth, since Mormonism is a missionary faith to all nations. For example, the Cardston, Alberta Temple, 1913, was one of the first with an explicit cross axis, almost cruciform but more like a Greek cross, drawing on Aztec temple motif per the architect's intention. He was inspired by ancient pyramids. Many temples are built on hilltops or elevated ground, aligning with the idea of a temple as the Lord's mountain. A number of them face east, not a requirement, but a tradition honoring the direction of Christ's coming. The Washington, D.C. Temple from 1974 is striking for its 6 spires in a formation similar to Salt Lake's, but much more modern. It famously evokes the Emerald City for some drivers on nearby roads. Its interior uses distinct geometric motifs in stained glass and lighting reminiscent of stars and constellations, embedding the cosmic imagery inside. The Las Vegas, Nevada temple features star-shaped windows. The Winter Quarters, Nebraska temple has a circular window with the Nuavo star motif, a five-pointed star with an elongated downward ray, a unique Mormon symbol representing the morning star. LDS theology is comfortable adopting and sanctifying geometric symbols. Even the compass and square symbol appears in the temple iconography, which interestingly overlaps with Freemasonry, though used differently, supposedly. The Salt Lake Temple's exterior famously has the Big Dipper constellation carved on the west facade, the 7 stars pointing to the North Star, symbolizing how the temple is a guide for the lost to find spiritual north. This is explicitly explained by early church leaders. Few religious buildings have an actual star map on them. That blending of astronomy and faith is very much in line with Joseph Smith's teachings that all truth, scientific and spiritual, comes from God, and that signs in heaven and earth testify of him. In more abstract terms, one could say Mormon temples combine 2 geometries, the vertical axis mundi, often via tower, spires, and the internal journey upward, and the horizontal gathering of Israel from the 4 corners, via orientation of multiple towers. The circle within a square is also often present. Many temple sites have circular features, fountains, walkways, inscribed in the square footprints. The Nuavo temple has a circular attic story called the Nuavo Temple Sun in its design. And even the City of Zion plan Joseph Smith drew up was a giant grid of square blocks with the temple at the center, essentially a big square subdivided, meant to be oriented with cardinal directions, replicating in a new world the idea of a holy city designed from biblical times. In sum, LDS temples as a genre reflect a modern attempt to restore ancient temple geometry and overlay it with new revelation. They see the temples as literally the place where heaven and earth meet. Therefore, the architecture is highly symbolic and carefully oriented. The use of cosmic motifs, sun, moon, stars, constellations, and the layering of spaces from telestial, earthly to celestial, heavenly show a conscious, sacred geometry. The use of cosmic motifs, sun, moon, stars, constellations, and the layering of spaces from telestial, earthly to celestial, heavenly show a conscious, sacred geometry aimed at teaching and transforming. As one church news article stated, all these symbols together convey that the temple is a place where heaven and earth come together for the benefit and salvation of mankind. A beautifully succinct description of any sacred space. The geometry, carvings, and layout of Mormon temples are expressly arranged to reinforce that meeting of worlds and to guide initiates along the path of eternal progression as understood in LDS doctrine. From this survey of religious architecture, we see that despite differences in doctrine and style, all these traditions use geometry as a bridge between the human and the divine. Whether through mandalas, crosses, stars, domes, or orientation lines, sacred architecture everywhere encodes messages about cosmology, theology, and community. It's a language of shape and number that speaks across cultures. Next, we will delve deeper into 2 specific chapters of architectural history: Gothic cathedrals and the Renaissance, where the philosophy of proportion and geometry reached new heights of self-awareness, and later we'll explore how esoteric movements and modern science have further engaged with the idea of sacred geometry. No discussion of sacred architecture is complete without the Gothic cathedrals of medieval Europe. These towering structures were explicitly conceived as microcosms of Christian cosmology. Bibles in stone, and geometry was one of their chief design tools. The Gothic builders, often educated in monastic schools or influenced by scholastic philosophy, believed mathematical order reflected divine order. The result? Cathedrals were proportioned, light, and vertically are orchestrated to induce awe and tell a theological story. Let's break down some key aspects. Gothic architecture is famous for its pointed arches, ribbed vaults, flying buttresses, and immense stained glass windows. All these contribute to unprecedented vertical loftiness and luminosity inside. But underlying the pretty form was a rigorous geometric scheme. Medieval master masons used simple instruments, compass, straight edge, a marked rope, to lay out plans and elevations on a tracing floor. They relied on what we called ad quadratum and ad triangulum techniques, starting with a square or triangle and generating the whole design from it. For example, at Chartres Cathedral, built around 1194 to 1220, analysis shows the ground plan and elevation are built from a basic square and equilateral triangle geometry. The nave's width to height, the spacing of piers, and so on follow multiples or subdivisions of a fundamental unit. Some argue it's the transept length or the bay diagonal. Scholars like Robert Bork have demonstrated how Chartreus's floor plan can be inscribed in a circle and square combination that yields the positions of key piers. Chartreus's builders likely used the geometry of the double square, ad quadratum. Is this just technical, or did they attach meaning? There's evidence they did imbue meaning. The school of Chartres, where scholars like theory of Chartres worked, believe God created the world with number, weight, measure, a very Pythagorean outlook. So designing a cathedral with perfect geometry was like participating in God's creation. The squared circle, a common drawing in Gothic plans, symbolized the marriage of earth, square, and heaven, circle. A well-known text, the 12th century De Administration by Abbot Chagger, who built St. Denis, the first Gothic church, reveals in how light and geometry led the soul to God. The dull mind rises to truth through which is material, he said, referring to the visual beauty of the new acquires proportions and luminous windows. Light was considered quasi-divine, following Pseudo-Dionysius' theology of light. The new large stained glass windows turned cathedrals into giant lanterns of colored light. When sunlight pours through Chartreus's great rose window, it paints the floor with patterns. It's not just pretty, it was meant to be an experience of the heavenly Jerusalem light. It's also worth noting that Chartreus's famous West Rose has a geometry of concentric circles and rosette petals that is itself a mandala-like symbol of cosmic harmony. Christ in majesty at center, 12 prophet circles around, and so on. The circular rose placed in a square facade is another square circle motif, often interpreted as Mary, rose without thorns, bridging the divine circle and worldly square. Acoustically, Gothic cathedrals have very long reverberation times, 5 to 8 seconds in some. This can blur speech, but makes chant and organ music ethereal. That might have a side effect. The spoken sermon is a bit lost, but the sung prayer is enhanced. So architecture chooses what to favor. That might have a side effect. The spoken sermon is a bit lost, but the sung prayer is enhanced. So architecture chooses what to favor. The mystical communal singing over the intellectual wordy sermon, one could argue. Another aspect, the labyrinth. Chartres famously has an 11-circuit labyrinth inlaid on its nave floor, about 12 meters diameter. Pilgrims would walk this labyrinth as a mini pilgrimage when actual pilgrimage to Jerusalem was not possible. You do it symbolically. Walking the labyrinth, a geometric path, is known to induce a meditative state. Modern experiments confirm that labyrinth walking can slow breathing, lower blood pressure, and improve focus, aligning with parasympathetic activation. Medieval Christians maybe didn't know the physiology, but they understood the psychological effect. Labyrinth walking was called Chemin de Jerusalem, a path to Jerusalem of the heart. The geometry of Chartres's labyrinth, which is precisely designed with a central rosette of 6 petals, perhaps symbolizing heaven, is essentially a spiritual tool. As we saw from Deepika Shukla's work, ritualized movement through a complex space triggers memory and emotional grounding, which in a religious context translate to imprinting the journey to God on one's soul. Every part of a Gothic cathedral had layered meaning. The west facade was often covered in sculpted biblical scenes, arranged in careful tiers. Even there, geometry ruled. The tympanum semicircular relief above the portal was usually proportioned to fit a scene of Last Judgment or Christ in majesty precisely within a half-circle shape, again a cosmic form. The 3 portals at Chartres' west front correspond to the Trinity, perhaps. The number of columns sometimes symbolize the apostles. While sometimes modern interpretations over-symbolize, what is clear is that the builders had a mindset of God is in the math. They wrote links in feet that correspond to biblical numbers. For instance, 144 feet long choir equals 12 by 12, number of heavenly Jerusalem's wall in Revelation. Many cathedrals are 360 feet long, a nice cosmic number, circle degrees, or have 7 bays in nave, sacred 7. While some of that might be coincidence, archival documents, for example, Villard de Honcourt's sketchbook from 1230, show geometrical diagrams for designs, and manuscripts by later architects that explicitly instruct on using polygonal geometry to design pinnacles with theological commentary. In the mid-20th century, a wave of art historians critiqued earlier overlay esoteric interpretations of Gothic geometry. They pointed out that while geometry was used, one must not project later mystic systems without evidence. However, recent more measured studies, like those by Lon R. Shelby or by Bork, confirm that there was a systematic use of simple geometry, circles, squares, triangles, at every stage of design. The great theologian Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century said that the mathematical sciences particularly exhibit order, symmetry, and limit, and these are the greatest forms of beauty. So beauty, via geometry, leads to God because God is beauty's source. The net effect of a worshiper in 1300 AD entering a cathedral like Amiens? Overwhelming awe. The height, the color light, the music echoing, it created an otherworldly ambience that suggested a foretaste of heaven. Abbot Sugar said he wanted St. Denis to brighten the minds so they may travel through the lights to the true light. From a neuro perspective, such spaces likely induce frisson, chills and goosebumps associated with awe, which is often described by believers as feeling the Holy Spirit. High vaults and large volumes can stimulate a slight sense of vertigo or smallness, triggering the brain's vastness perception equals awe. Research shows awe can increase altruism and reduce stress. Maybe cathedrals did that, reinforcing social and spiritual well-being. This is high medieval Latin Christianity, steeped in scholasticism, joining faith and reason. The cathedral is an embodiment of scholastic thought, rational yet full of mysticism. There were also mystical writers like the anonymous author of The Cloud of Unknowing who advocated using a single word in prayer repeatedly to reach God, not unlike a mantra. Similarly, some say the rose window or labyrinth could be used as focal points for contemplative prayer, a quasi-meditative practice. So we see almost an intersection of West and Eastern spiritual techniques, but through architecture. Finally, by late Gothic, some extreme theories occurred, like numerologists started finding secret numbers like 153, miraculous fish catch number, in cathedrals. Some Masons got into Hermetic ideas. This leads us to the next section, how in Renaissance and beyond, esoteric and occult interpretations of geometry and architecture emerged, from Kabbalah to Freemasonry to New Age. The Gothic cathedral, though built by faithful Catholics, became later a canvas onto which occultists projected their ideas, like the myth of Templar secrets encoded or alchemical symbols in cathedrals, much of which is speculative. We'll explore that in the next section. But as a concluding thought here, the Gothic cathedral stands as perhaps the peak of pre-modern sacred architecture where every physical aspect, from grand layout to tiny stone tracery, was conceptually integrated into a spiritual worldview via geometry. If one reads it, as Umberto Eco said, it's like a Summa Theologica made palatable. Geometry was the language that made that possible, translating ineffable beliefs into harmonious forms. The Renaissance marked a rebirth of classical knowledge and a renewed fascination with mathematics as the key to beauty, especially in architecture. Renaissance architects and theorists explicitly studied and applied Vitruvian principles, named after Vitruvius, the 1st century BCE Roman architect who wrote that a well-shaped building, like a well-shaped man, must have harmonious proportions. This era saw sacred geometry not as a secret mysticism, but as an intellectual humanist pursuit. By designing churches and temples with perfect proportions, architects believed they were imitating the rational order of God's creation. And as art historian Rudolf Wittgauer famously demonstrated in Architectural Principles in the Age of Humanism, Renaissance architects like Alberti, Francesco di Giorgio, Bramante, and Palladio employed geometric ratios, often drawn from music and Pythagorean theory, to give their buildings a sense of universal harmony. Humanism placed man, and by extension the human body and experience, at the center of inquiry. But it was a religious humanism, man as God's greatest creation. Thus, the Vitruvian man drawing by Leonardo, the man inscribed in a circle and square, became an emblem of the era. It illustrated the concept that the human body is the measure of the world, and by extension, buildings as microcosms should reflect the proportions of man to be in tune with the cosmos. Many Renaissance churches shifted from the longitudinal medieval basilica to centralized plans, round, square, Greek cross, because the circle was seen as the most perfect form and the one most appropriate to God, as Alberti argued. For example, Santa Maria della Consolazione at Todi, begun 1508, is a near-Greek cross church with a domed center, often cited as reflecting ideal geometry. Leon Battista Alberti, in 1485, asserted that beauty in architecture is the harmony and concord of all parts achieved in such a manner that nothing could be added or taken away except for the worse. A definition echoing geometric perfection, where altering a perfect shape only makes it worse. Alberti and others defined beauty as an objective quality arising from correct proportions and symmetry. We owe to Rudolf Wittkower a deep analysis of how these proportional systems worked. He found, for instance, that Palladio, the great 16th century Venetian architect, used simple whole number ratios for his villa plans, 3:4, 4:5, and 2:3, and so on. Like San Giorgio Maggiore in Venice, the facade can be read as two interlocking temple fronts, each derived from simple geometric relationships, creating a pleasing harmonic composition. Wittkower noted Renaissance architects were effectively translating musical harmony into architecture. Many believe that because God created an ordered cosmos, the music of the spheres, a church built on musical ratios would resonate with the same cosmic order, elevating the soul of anyone inside. This is the era when the term symphony in stone could be quite literal in concept. A concrete example, Tempietto of San Pietro a Montorio by Bramante around 1502, a small circular shrine in Rome marking St. Peter's crucifixion spot. It's a perfect circle plan with a peristyle of Tuscan columns, topped by a hemispherical dome. Its diameter and height are carefully calculated. The whole design is a study in circles, cylinders, and spheres. The Tempietto was lauded as a revival of classical perfection. Indeed, Bramante was inspired by Vitruvius and by what he thought early Christian martyria looked like. The harmony of its geometry, a centralized plan on a proportional stylobate, made it a microcosm of the Renaissance worldview in many eyes. Man's reason, geometry, glorifying God. Churches like Santa Maria Novella, Alberti's in 1470, also show open use of geometry. Alberti used a square module to govern the facade. The height of the facade equals its width, forming a square outline, and a smaller square dictates the placement of the circular window, and so on. The facade even displays a circle within a square motif. The great round window set in a square panel, and has scrolls that geometrically reconcile the different heights of the nave and aisles, a famously elegant solution to blending a tall central nave roof and lower side roofs into one harmonious front, achieved by spiral scroll volutes, a geometric spiral shape. In Florence, Filippo Brunelleschi earlier had initiated many of these ideas. His Pazzi Chapel in 1440 is a masterpiece of geometric clarity, a central square room with a dome on pendentives, a porch with a hemispherical dome, all proportions using simple ratios, like the width of the chapel equals the height of the dome's base, and so on. The decoration even emphasizes geometry, roundels, squares, and an umbrella-like ribbed dome. Entering it, one senses calm order, precisely the intent of creating an architectural harmonium mundi. Wittkower's research highlights how Renaissance architecture was reinterpreted through geometric principles, mathematic proportions, and humanist philosophy. He emphasized that these architects weren't just copying antiquity. They were solving the main problems that moved Renaissance architects, one of which was, what is the ideal proportion system for a church? They saw themselves as solving a cosmic puzzle, aligning with divine truth. For instance, in Milan Cathedral, it began in the Gothic era but continued on a Renaissance influence. There's a strong attempt to tie the new crossing and dome, planned by Leonardo and others, into rational proportion with the nave. The outcome was somewhat eclectic, but the thought process is documented. They considered a centralized dome to unify the Gothic layout. One thing worth noting, not all welcomed these changes. There was tension between the older Gothic style, viewed by Renaissance humanists as less rational, Gothic ignorance, as Anderson's Constitutions of Freemasons derided it, and the new classical geometry. English Freemasons in the early 1700s even celebrated how geometry recovered from Gothic to Palladian styles, which is a hint of how geometry and Freemasonry linked, to be discussed later. By High Renaissance and Baroque, architects grew even more ambitious with geometry. Guarino Guarini in the 17th century designed churches in Turin with star polygon domes and hyper-complex spatial geometry. Like the chapel of the Holy Shroud has a dome of overlapping hexagons that create a dazzling star at the apex. Though Baroque veers from pure Renaissance simplicity, it's still very geometric, using ovals, spirals, complex curves, showing an evolution in the sacred geometry concept to more dynamic forms, perhaps reflecting an evolving view of the cosmos, Galileo and Newton's discoveries making a more complex universe picture. Circling back to Wittkower, in the final chapter of his book titled The Problem of Harmonic Proportion in Architecture, he explored how architects like Palladio might have even tried to encode musical scales into room proportions. For instance, a room 6 by 9 by 6 in some unit might correspond to a fifth or fourth interval. Rooted in Neoplatonic thought, this approach linked mathematical perfection to divine beauty, shaping the aesthetics and spatial order of Renaissance architecture. This encapsulates the Renaissance ethos, mathematics, especially geometry, as God's hidden signature in the world, which man can use in art to echo and glorify the Creator. To provide a clear example with sources, Wittkower mapped out Palladio's villa plans and found Palladio had a visual diagram of his proportional system, essentially how a villa's room relate like a well-structured musical piece. Palladio, of course, wrote the 4 books of architecture in 1570, where he gave many floor plans with dimensions. One finds rooms that are square or in simple ratios to each other, like 15 by 15 next to 15 by 30 and so on. The effect is unity and variety. Much like a well-composed piece of music has reoccurring themes in different keys. Beyond ratios, Renaissance builders were fascinated by Platonic solids and perfect figures. Some churches attempted unusual centralized plans. Santa Maria della Consolazione, a Greek cross plus semicircles, and San Bernardino alla Ossa in Milan, an octagon. The idea was to find the most exquisite geometry for a church. Many treatises even debated which is more perfect, a circle or a Greek cross, which is basically a square plus arms. The consensus tended to favor the circle as metaphysically perfect, but practical liturgical needs often led to cross or Latin cross plans. Thus, a hybrid was common. A Latin cross plan, but with a large central dome. St. Peter's in Rome is the prime example, designed by Bramante as a Greek cross modified to a Latin cross, but retaining the dominating central dome. To tie this all back to sacred geometry more generally, Renaissance architecture was a conscious revival of using geometry to reflect cosmic order with academic rigor. What in medieval times might have been transmitted by Mason's law now is discussed in printed books and humanist circles. One can say the Renaissance intellectualized sacred geometry, laying the groundwork for later scholars like Kepler, who tried inscribing Platonic solids in orbits of planets, and even esotericists. Indeed, as the Renaissance gave way to the Enlightenment, groups like Freemasons, born in 1717, but with earlier roots, framed geometry as a divine science, linking them to the temple builders of yore. We now turn to those esoteric and mystical movements that explicitly cherish sacred geometry as a key to spiritual insight. Throughout history, there has always been currents of thought seeking deeper, hidden meanings in architecture. From late antiquities Neoplatonists and Theurgists, through Renaissance Magi and Enlightenment-era Freemasons, to modern occultists and New Age mystics, many have believed that sacred architecture holds secret knowledge or can be used for magical or spiritual ends beyond the mainstream doctrine. This part of the show explores how geometry and architecture was embraced by esoteric traditions and sometimes exaggerated into fanciful theories. Here we have temples as talismans, city plans as star maps, and large rooms as symbolic universes. In the waning days of the Roman Empire, 3rd to 5th century AD, pagan philosophers like Iamblichus and Proclus developed the practice of theurgy, literally God-working rituals meant to invoke gods or divine energies into the material realm. They believed that ritual layout and architecture could facilitate the descent of divine powers. For instance, Iamblichus in On the Mysteries implies that carefully designed statues, symbols, and temple arrangements create a microcosm that attracts the indwelling of gods. He distinguishes this from the mere prayer. Theurgy is like building a circuit for the divine current to flow. One anecdote is that the Platonic Academy in Athens arranged its gardens as a geometrized model of the cosmos for meditative walks, speculative but consistent with Neoplatonic analogies. As Christianity took over, such practices went underground or were folded into esoteric Christian mysticism. The idea of Solomon's temple as a divine microcosm persisted. Medieval Kabbalists, Jewish mystics from 12th to the 14th century, meditated on Solomon's temple proportions as encoded secrets of the cosmos. They viewed the first temple's architecture, described in the Bible with precise measurements, as a kind of geometric map of the spiritual worlds. For example, the Holy of Holies being a cube of 20 cubits, a perfect cube, symbolizing the Sephirah of Malkuth or something similar in Kabbalah. Christian esoterics likewise saw significance, like the shape of churches as a cross, obvious meaning, but also the rose window as Mary's mystic rose and the labyrinth as the path to Christ. Fast forward to the Renaissance, 15th to 16th century, an explosion of interest in Hermeticism, astrology, Neoplatonism, and yes, architecture's hidden meaning. Figures like Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola in Florence revived Pythagorean and Platonic mysticism. They believed mathematical harmonies were the language of the cosmos and the mind of God. Renaissance architects such as Leon Battista Alberti and later Francesco Giorgi and Cesare Cesariano infused their church designs with both Vitruvian rationality and mystical numerology. Rudolf Wittauer's famous study Architectural Principles in the Age of Humanism shows how Bramante, Francesco di Giorgio, and others intentionally used simple musical ratios, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, and so on, in ground plans of churches, seeing them as reflecting cosmic harmony. They were inspired by Vitruvius, a first-century Roman whose rediscovered treatise said temples should be proportioned like the ideal human body, and by new translations of Hermetic texts that taught as above, so below. One extreme example, Filippo Brunelleschi, when building the dome of Florence's Santa Maria del Fiore in the 1420s, used not just engineering, but also symbolic elements. Some claim the dome's 8 ribs and 5 visible divisions were arranged to correspond to the 8 beatitudes and 5 wounds of Christ. We're not sure if he intended that, but such interpretations were common. Later, Sir Christopher Wren, who built St. Paul's in London around the late 17th century, was a Freemason and interested in geometry. Some say he oriented St. Paul's to catch the setting sun on the summer solstice along the nave, an echo to Stonehenge possibly? Possibly apocryphal, but Wren did incorporate sacred geometry texts in his library. Freemasonry, an initiatory fraternal order with roots in operative stonemason guilds and formally organized in 717, kept the language of geometry alive as sacred alphabet of moral and spiritual truth. In Masonic theology, deity is the grand architect of the universe, a master builder whose creation is structured, proportioned, and lawful. Even the most recognizable emblem, the square and compass, often with the letter G, carries this premise. Many interpret the G as standing for geometry, as well as God, suggesting that geometry is not merely a tool but a principle at the heart of Masonry. A common Masonic formulation makes the claim explicit. Geometry is the first and noblest of science, the very basis upon which superstructure of Masonry is erected, a bridge between physical craft and inner transformation. The bridge becomes tangible in the lodge itself. Every lodge room is essentially a symbolic temple of Solomon, with lore centered on Solomon's temple, the master builder Hiram Abiff, and the craft's mythic origins in sacred architecture. The lodge is typically an oblong rectangle oriented east-west, reflecting temple symbolism and the idea of moving from darkness towards light. The floor is often black and white checkered mosaic pavement, a tessellation of squares representing duality, light and dark, good and evil, opposites held in tension, a tessellation of squares representing duality, light and dark, good and evil, opposites held in tension, and the varied textures of creation. Above the ceiling may be painted as a starry blue firmament, turning the room into a microcosm. Floor is earth, ceiling is heavens. At the entrance stand the 2 pillars, Boaz and Jachin, directly drawn from the biblical account of Solomon's temple, sometimes topped with globes, terrestrial and celestial, which quietly reinforces the Masonic habit of thinking in cosmic coordinates. geography, and astronomy as forms of sacred knowledge. The working tools are not decorative. They are moral instruments disguised as geometry. The square implies virtue, rightness, foundation, and honest action. The compass implies restraint, due measure, and the arc of the spiritual realm and self-mastery. Their intersection becomes a visual theology, the spiritual governing the earthly, the higher principle ruling the lower impulse. In other words, Masonry takes the physical tools of the builder and turns them into a symbolic system for building the self. The lodge is the temple, but the real project is the interior one, constructing a spiritual temple within. This is why geometry is singled out in Masonic education. The second-degree fellowcraft traditionally includes a lecture on the 7 liberal arts and sciences, with special emphasis on geometry as the discipline that gives order and meaning to the cosmos and offers a universal framework for grasping philosophical and metaphysical ideas. In the Masonic view, sacred geometry provides a mechanism of universal proportion for discerning relationships between the physical and spiritual. Geometry has both practical science and mystical key. This is also why Masonic culture has long been attracted to classic geometric emblems. The hexagram, Seal of Solomon, 2 interlaced triangles, reoccurs in Masonic and adjacent esoteric art as synthesis of opposites, though it's not uniquely Masonic and has a long, widespread history. Likewise, Masonic literature in the 18th century frequently references Euclid's 47th proposition, the Pythagorean theorem, as an emblem of the craft, an icon of perfected measure and of triangles and squares reconciled through lawful ratio. The theorem's status in Masonic imagination hints at an older assumption. Geometric knowledge signifies insight, and at a minimum marks the trained builder, whether of stone or of self. Sometimes the symbolism breaks out of the lodge and into literal architecture. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, many cities built Masonic temples as lodge halls, often with classical facades reflecting admiration for Solomon's temple, antiquity, and the Enlightenment reverence for proportion. A striking example is the House of the Temple in Washington, D.C., Scottish Rite headquarters since 1915, a neoclassical, pyramid-like structure modeled on the mausoleum of Halicarnassus, featuring a 33-column colonnade, a number resonant with the Scottish Rite's highest degree. Its interiors include octagonal and circular ritual rooms. The main temple room is famously described in terms of double cube proportion, evoking descriptions of sacred interior proportions associated with Solomon's temple traditions. And the central altar placement beneath a coffered dome with an oculus creates a deliberately cosmic ambience. Even where the symbolism is subtle, the message is the same. Geometry is not ornament. It is the emotional and moral architecture of the space. And then there is city planning. Washington, D.C. has long been known for claims that Masons embedded symbols in the geometry of the Capitol. Angles between the White House, Capitol, and monuments. Partial pentagrams traced through avenues. Alignments that feel too elegant to be accidental. It is true that several founding fathers were Masons, and the Enlightenment-era planners enjoyed symbolic order. The same dynamic appears in one of the most famous occult geometry urban legends, Nicholas Hawksmoor's churches in London. Hawksmoor, late 17th to 18th century, a colleague of Wren, designed several dramatic churches. Much later, writers like Ian Sinclair and Alan Moore spun dark, mesmerizing narratives suggesting Hawksmoor placed occult symbols in the city, aligning churches into pentagrams or ritual networks for sinister purpose, most famously in Moors from Hell. One claim holds that churches like Christ Church Spitalfields and St. Anne Limehouse, among others, form a pentagram on the map. Historians, however, have generally argued these alignments are coincidental or driven by pragmatic constraints like land availability and parish needs. The mythology was amplified by fringe works, often traced to a 1970s-era occultizing treatment of London's layout that took creative liberties. And once a story like that takes root, straight lines start appearing everywhere. Modern scholars, including figures such as Lindsay Jones, have emphasized how these myths arise. Classism, obelisks, and strong axial design can look secret to modern eyes even when they're simply part of architectural language. Hawksmoor did use bold and sometimes odd motifs, which makes the legend feel plausible, but evidence points to an eccentric, powerful designer rather than a clandestine magician. Also, Freemasonry doesn't need conspiracy to be geometrically profound. Its core move is quieter and more enduring. Sacred geometry turned inward. The rough stone becomes the self. The lodge becomes the world. The tools become ethical disciplines. Masonic language makes this explicit in the metaphor of the rough ashlar, the imperfect stone to be shaped toward the perfect ashlar, often imagined as a cut cube, geometrically perfected and therefore symbolically perfected, a moral and spiritual squaring of the human being. The square, level, and plumb are implied not to walls but to character. In that sense, Masonry preserves an Enlightenment-era reverence for geometry as a kind of divine science while repurposing it as spiritual practice. Not building physical temples, but building the temple within, using geometry as the symbolic grammar of transformation. The Rosicrucian current, emerging in the 17th century through the enigmatic manifestos, the Fama, the Confessio, and the allegorical chemical wedding, did not so much found the visible architectural style as it helped preserve and intensify a powerful idea. Geometric symbols are containers of hidden wisdom. Rosicrucianism blended alchemy, Protestant mysticism, and Hermetic philosophy into an ethos where number, proportion, and diagram become the silent language of spiritual realities. Even when it produced few permanent buildings, it produced something more durable, a template for how later esoteric orders would build meaning into space. From the beginning, Rosicrucian law is architectural, just not in the ordinary sense. The manifestos describe an allegorical sanctuary, the house of the Holy Spirit, and most famously the tomb of Christian Rosencreutz, imagined as a geometrically saturated inner temple. In the story, the vault is described as seven-sided, a heptagonal chamber, with each wall 5 feet wide and 8 feet high, filled with occult emblems with a circular altar beneath a round dome. The ceiling is described with a cosmic globe and inscribed text circling above, so the room itself becomes a microcosm, polygonal earth structure married to a circular heaven canopy, with a central altar as access. The numerology is deliberate. 7, a classic number of spiritual completion, and the paired measures 5 and 8, noted by many interpreters as resonant numbers, also Fibonacci numbers, which invites the modern eye toward growth pattern symbolism. And the heptagon itself is an occult tell. A regular heptagon cannot be constructed perfectly with compass and straightedge, which makes it feel like the story is whispering, "We know a geometry you don't." Many readers have seen Kabbalistic and alchemical significance implied in those dimensions and that unusual shape. In other words, Rosicrucianism encoded sacred architecture as initiatory allegory, a temple you enter with the mind, not the body. That Rosicrucian instinct, geometry as the grammar of the hidden, flows directly into the 19th and 20th century occult revival, where orders began designing ritual rooms as literal, walkable diagrams. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, founded 1888 in England, Rosicrucian adjacent though not identical, deliberately structured temple space according to the Kabbalistic tree of life, the 4 directions, and the 4 classical elements. In the Golden Dawn's Isis Urania temple in London, the room could function as a 360 degrees elemental mandala. Walls hung with large painted tablets and symbolic implements placed in each quarter: air in the east, fire in the south, water in the west, earth in the north. So the candidate stood inside a compass of metaphysics. The officers' movements during ritual were not random choreography, but geometry in action, tracing pentagrams in the air, turning and crossing in deliberate patterns, leading candidates through a mapped floor plan that turns initiation into embodied symbolism. Even details like a black and white tiled floor, echoing Masonic duality, appears as a visual lesson. Opposites are real, but they are meant to be transcended through ordered work. Crowley's later Ordo Templi Orientis, or the OTO, and other magical orders inherited and amplified this spatial logic. Modern occult literature becomes diagram-heavy for exactly this reason. It treats the ritual room as a living equation. The lodge is described as an oblong stretching east to west as the universe, sometimes framed in double cube symbolism, 2 cubes end to end, to communicate cosmic proportion and the idea of a temple that mirrors a structured universe. Altars are centered and inscribed with layered figures, triangles, circles, crosses, each intended to lock meaning into matter. In some Golden Dawn-derived diagrams, including those associated with Adeptus Minor work, you find multi-layer compositions like a cross within a triangle within a circle, a nested hierarchy that encodes layered realities, elements, spirit, and the boundary of the cosmos, all in one geometry. Threaded through all of this is an even older geometric lineage that Rosicrucians and revivalists love to claim as a spiritual ancestor: John Dee. Dee predates the Rosicrucian manifestos, but is often treated as a forefather of the same impulse, especially because he fused mathematics, angelic communication, and diagrammatic magic. Dee wrote an influential preface to Euclid's Elements in English, championing mathematics as a noble and even spiritual discipline, and he developed an angelic system, Enochian magic, that relies heavily on grids and sigils. His Enochian tablets are lettered matrices, geometry as gateway. And the Sigillum Dei Ameth is a masterwork of occult geometry, an inscribed diagram of circles, heptagons, pentagrams, and names, often described in terms of a 49 7x7 structure and heptagonal rings of divine names, a kind of Western mandala intended to encapsulate divine forces and angelic orders. In the Dee lineage, geometry is not merely symbolic, it is operative, a language the angels supposedly use, a pattern that holds power. When Rosicrucians talk about hidden knowledge of the universe, they often mean exactly this kind of thing: diagrams that encode names of God, hierarchies of beings, elements, and cosmic laws. By the 18th century, Rosicrucian revivals such as the Golden Rosicrucians in Germany continued to treat geometry as mysticism, and related currents like Martinism carried geometric and numeric speculation forward. Figures such Louis Claude de Saint Martin are often linked to this milieu and are remembered for metaphysical diagramming, attempts to represent emanation, unity, and divine order through structured symbolic tables, like tables of unity, where letters and numbers become geometry in another register. And although Rosicrucianism's earliest architecture was largely allegorical, later Rosicrucian-influenced organizations did build physical spaces that externalized their symbolic worldview. In the 20th century, groups like Amorc created temple-like environments, often in Egyptian revival style, reflecting the esoteric fascination with Egypt as a keeper of sacred measure. The Rosicrucian Egyptian Museum and Park in San Jose, California, is a prime example. Pseudo-ancient Egyptian forms, obelisks, arches, and symbol-saturated layouts meant to create a charged environment, spaces designed not just to be visited, but to be felt. These groups also explicitly taught sacred geometry as a study discipline, constructing shapes, meditating on proportion, working with Platonic solids and symbolic forms, treating geometry as a path of initiation. What unites the Rosicrucian manifestos, Dee's angelic diagrams, Golden Dawn temple choreography, OTO altar geometry, and modern Rosicrucian parks is one governing principle: the microcosm can be engineered to contact the macrocosm. If a temple can be a model of the universe, then a room can be a model of a temple, and a symbol can be a model of a room. Occult practice makes the latent geometry of older sacred architecture explicit: the magic circle drawn on the floor, the pentagram or seal of Solomon sketched to constrain forces or concentrate attention, the letter grids used as keys, the careful quartering of space to elemental directions. The old sacred geometries are no longer only embedded in cathedrals and pyramids, they become portable, reproducible technologies of ritual. Thus, while Rosicrucians may not have a signature architectural style in the way Gothic or Renaissance builders did, they profoundly shaped the modern Western imagination of sacred geometry. They preserve the idea that geometry is not only measurement but revelation, an encoded wisdom tradition. Many later New Age fascinations, flower of life motifs, Merkaba star tetrahedron symbolism, Platonic solid mysticism draw indirectly from these esoteric streams. Rosicrucianism, and the occult revival it helped inspire kept the sacred geometry tradition alive by turning architecture into allegory, allegory into ritual space, and ritual space into a deliberate instrument for inner change. Now let's move on to Rudolf Steiner's organic geometry. Anthroposophy, founded by Rudolf Steiner in the early 20th century, is another movement that deeply engaged with sacred geometry, though in a very different aesthetic. Steiner was a polymath, philosopher, and mystic who branched from theosophy. He believed in a spiritual science that could systematically understand the invisible forces shaping nature and consciousness. In architecture, Steiner put these ideas to test by designing the Goetheanum, a pair of buildings, first built 1913 to 1922, which burned down, and then the second built 1925 to 1928, still standing in Dornach, Switzerland, to serve as anthroposophical centers. The first Goetheanum was a striking building of organic, non-right-angled forms. It had two large intersecting domes made of wood, kind of like two intersecting spheres. The building had virtually no straight lines, columns were gently contoured, windows had unusual shapes, somewhat like flower petals or geometrically deformed shapes. The building had virtually no straight lines, columns were gently contoured, and windows had an unusual shape, somewhat like flower petals or geometrically deformed shapes. Steiner was very much against the deadness of right angles. He felt more curvilinear dynamic forms were closer to life forces. However, he wasn't rejecting geometry. Rather, he was exploring non-Euclidean or metamorphic geometry. He once said the Goetheanum design arose from moving, living geometry rather than the fixed forms of classical buildings. He gave lectures on form and artistic sense and sacred proportions. He believed the laws of geometry were not static but could be evolved. For instance, a circle is a static snapshot, but a spiral is a circle in movement. The first Goetheanum combined a sort of double dome. Some see an image of interpenetrating spheres, like the union of spirit and matter, with a complex ground plan. It had 7 column types in the Great Hall, each capital and base differently formed. Some say they represented the 7 planetary forces or the 7 classical planets, thus cosmologically significant. The ground plan, from above, looks roughly like 2 overlapping circles, vesica Pisces shape, a geometry symbol with significance of the intersection of 2 worlds. Steiner, familiar with Rosicrucian and Masonic symbolism, certainly imbued meaning in numbers and shapes, though not in obvious ways. The second Goetheanum, built of concrete, had a sculpted form, often described as anthroposophical expressionist. It's asymmetrical yet balanced. Its windows again are irregular shapes but arranged rhythmically. Walking around it, one experiences constantly changing curvatures. Some authors describe it as crystalline or protean. The idea was that the building itself should evoke inner movement and reflection, not just present a static symbol. Steiner saw architecture as frozen music, but he tried to thaw it a bit, making the forms flow. Anthroposophy also influenced Waldorf school architecture, schools that often have flowing layouts, nonlinear forms to create child-friendly, imaginative environments. And Camp Hill communities, villages for people with special needs, often with organic architecture. All of these avoid sharp corners and utilize harmonic proportions. Steiner's use of geometry was also explicit in other arts. Eurythmy, a movement art, uses geometric floor patterns for dancers. Biodynamic gardening uses geometric preparations like the placement of planting by zodiac sections. And Steiner gave lectures like Mathematical and Geometrical Relationships in the Evolution of Mankind, where he tried to correlate historical periods with geometric progressions. In summary, anthroposophical architecture is a unique case of sacred geometry. It doesn't display obvious Platonic solids or cathedral-like symmetry. Instead, it attempts to embody living geometry, akin to forms found in nature, plants, bones, and etc., but elevated to a spiritual archetype. Steiner's approach reminds us that geometry isn't only Euclidean or classical. It can be projective, organic, and 4-dimensional. He was interested in the 4th dimension and non-Euclidean ideas as well. By designing spaces with flowering geometries, he wanted to engage the etheric life forces. Modern neuroarchitecture might say such environments are less stressful because of the absence of hard lines, possibly aligning with his intuition that straight lines oppose life, curves enhance it. Whether one agrees with Steiner's spiritual science or not, the Goetheanum stands as a remarkable sacred building that defies categorization, a fruit of esoteric geometry integrated into architecture on a grand scale. Before we wrap up this part of the show, I would like to touch on one more thing: Swedenborgianism. Swedenborgianism, the Church of the New Jerusalem, based on Emanuel Swedenborg's writings, did not develop a distinct architectural style widely, but Swedenborg's theological framework had a strong spatial and geometric imagination. Swedenborg, from 1688 to 1772, was a scientist turned mystic who had detailed visions of heaven and wrote about the correspondences between spiritual and natural worlds. He described heaven as having form and structure analogous to the human form, the grand man concept, and that even love corresponds to heat, wisdom to light, and so on. These correspondences meant that a well-ordered physical space could correspond to spiritual realities. In the 19th century, some Swedenborgian church buildings were constructed, notably in the U.S. One example is the San Francisco Swedenborgian Church in 1895. It's a simple arts and crafts style chapel, but filled with symbolic intent. The ceiling has exposed beams meant to recall an upside-down ship or ark, or the vault of heaven. The plan is rectangular but intimate, a kind of human-scale home reflecting the warmth of interior devotion. There was an emphasis on integrating with nature, reflecting Swedenborg's idea of the natural world as a mirror of the spiritual. So while geometry isn't allowed here, the philosophy is that material design should humbly correspond to heavenly order. Simplicity, harmony, use of the circle of the sun perhaps in the round window. Some Swedenborgians were also involved in early landscape design with correspondence ideas, like gardens laid out representing states of mind. Also, the notion of the New Jerusalem from Revelation, interpreted by Swedenborg as a new church, might inspire architecture. In Revelation, the New Jerusalem is a perfect cube city descending from heaven, 12,000 stadia each side. Swedenborg saw that as symbolic. But interesting, some literal Swedenborgians drew city plans trying to incorporate symmetric order, though none manifested fully. We might also consider Frank Lloyd Wright, who wasn't Swedenborgian but was exposed to Swedenborgian ideals through his uncle Jenkin Lloyd Jones, a Universalist who admired Swedenborg. Wright's early prairie style and later designs emphasized organic architecture, unity, and the temple idea for even a home. He and Steiner differ, but share the idea that straight lines were problematic. Wright said lines in nature are never purely straight. They always follow some law of growth. In essence, Swedenborgian influence on architecture was subtle. It encouraged an approach where every detail has meaning, corresponds to something higher, which is a hallmark of sacred architecture generally. A door isn't just a door, it's also an entry to spiritual understanding, and so on. Many churches do that, like Gothic cathedrals, 3 doors for Trinity, rose window for Mary, or the Holy Spirit. But Swedenborgians systemized it in theology. The Swedenborgian might say the circle represents eternity and God's love. The square represents the natural truth on which the spiritual stands, and so on, in line with general symbolism but integrated into their sermons and worldview. In sum, the esoteric movements of the last few centuries kept alive the flame of sacred geometry, often outside mainstream religion. They experimented with new forms, Steiner's freeform curves, revived old symbols, Masons with Solomon's wisdom and Euclid, Rosicrucians with alchemical vaults, and built new sacred spaces, Masonic temples, the Goetheanum, that expanded the vocabulary of what a spiritual building can look like. They also laid conceptual groundwork that influenced the New Age movement, which heavily embraces sacred geometry nowadays. Think of the popularity of the flower of life pattern, Metatron's cube, and so on as meditation and art motifs. Many of these geometric diagrams come from esoteric traditions like Kabbalah or Hermeticism, which Rosicrucians and others propagated. Having traversed antiquity, world religions, and esoteric philosophies, we now find ourselves at the present crossroads of science and spirituality. One might ask, beyond symbolic resonance, does sacred geometry have measurable effects on human consciousness or health? In the next part of the show, we will examine the emerging field of neuroarchitecture and related research that probes how fractals, symmetry, light, the brain, and emotions, effectively bringing the discussion full circle from ancient intuition to modern evidence. We've toured millennia of architecture and its intended spiritual effects. Now let's turn to what modern science, especially environmental psychology, cognitive neuroscience, and physiology, has to say about how space and geometry affect the human brain and body. Fascinatingly, many findings affirm the intuitions of old. Sacred spaces do measurably influence stress, emotion, and cognition. Science may strip away mystical vocabulary, preferring neuroarchitecture to spiritual aura, but the convergence is striking. Architecture is not passive shelter. It is an active agent acting on psyche and physiology. In recent years, neuroarchitecture has emerged as a hybrid field bridging architecture, neuroscience, and psychology to understand how the built environment shapes brain states and well-being. It examines how shape, volume, proportion, light, color, texture, and acoustics can trigger neural responses that alter mood and behavior. Sacred spaces are high-intensity case studies of this principle. Think of the goosebumps in a vast cathedral, the quiet exhale in a Zen garden, the hush you feel in a dim sanctuary as stained glass breaks sunlight into color. What modern research suggests, again and again, is that the features religious builders selected for theological, symbolic, or aesthetic reasons often overlap with what our nervous system reads as safe, meaningful, and regulating. Environmental psychology has repeatedly shown that certain environmental qualities reliably shift stress physiology. Chronic noise, harshness, and visually impoverished settings can elevate stress responses. Chronic noise, harshness, and visually impoverished settings can elevate stress responses. Environments with natural elements, coherent patterning, and sensory comfort tend to reduce stress and promote calm. That aligns almost uncannily with classic sacred space ingredients: cloister gardens, greenery and quiet; filtered light; water sounds, fountains in mosques and temple courtyards; shaded courtyards; and ordered ornament. Put in modern terms, many sacred spaces appear to reduce fight or flight sympathetic activation and support rest and digest parasympathetic activity, without ever needing to speak that language. In the old frame, it's sanctity. In the lab frame, it's regulation. One of the clearest examples is ceiling height. A classic set of experiments found that higher ceilings tend to prime concepts like freedom and promote more relational, abstract processing, while lower ceilings prime confinement and promote more item-specific, detail-oriented processing. This maps beautifully onto sacred design across traditions. A soaring nave, dome, or vault doesn't just impress. It nudges the mind towards the big picture: eternity, meaning, and transcendence. Meanwhile, the deliberately low, intimate dimensions of a Zen tea room or meditation cell, often requiring one to bow or crouch to enter, pull attention into the immediate, the precise, the present. Different sacred geometries tune cognition differently. Grand volume invites expansive thought. Tight enclosure invites concentrated mindfulness. Another reoccurring finding in neuroaesthetics is that many people show a preference for curvy linear interiors over harshly rectilinear ones, often reporting curves as more beautiful or welcoming. Researchers interpret this partly through threat bias. Sharp angles can unconsciously read as hazard, while curvature reads as safe. Sacred architecture is packed with curves, arches, apses, domes, vaults, and it may be unintentionally exploiting the bias to make the space feel both protective and elevating. Even when the intention was symbolic, heavenly dome, cosmic arches, the nervous system still receives it as effect. Sacred spaces don't only change mood. They can change attention and memory. Rich environments, especially those that are visually detailed but organized, can be cognitively engaging without becoming chaotic. When a space is loaded with structured symbolism, it can function like a spatial narrative. As you move, your mind tags meaning to locations, thresholds, and images. This is why ritualized movement matters so much. The labyrinth is a perfect example. A geometrically ordered path walked slowly, often with prayer or contemplation. In cognitive terms, it resembles the method of loci, the memory palace technique. Pairing ideas with spatial progression can enhance recall. Medieval monastic traditions explicitly understood this. Cathedrals were not just places of worship, but also structured mnemonic worlds, an architecture of memory and practice. And here's the key convergence. Research on meditative walking and ritual movement suggests that slow, rhythmic, goal-directed paths can increase parasympathetic activity, relaxation, and may support emotional grounding and memory consolidation, especially when movement is paired with meaningful cues and repeated turns. Which makes me think about a lot of rituals. Symmetry and pattern. Why mandalas work on the brain. Humans are pattern finders. Symmetry is easy for the visual system to process. It's fluent, low friction, and that fluency is often experienced as beauty or rightness. Neuroscience research on symmetry shows robust automatic brain responses to symmetrical structure, including characteristic neural signatures like the symmetry-specific responses measured in EEG, ERP work, and consistent engagement of visual processing networks. This helps explain the cross-cultural magnetism of mandalas, radial and bilateral symmetries, repetition with variation, structured complexity that is neither random nor blank. The mind can explore without getting lost. The eye can roam without being overwhelmed. The result is a feeling that the world is intelligible, that chaos is held inside order. And now acoustics is not a side effect in sacred building. It's part of the psycho-spiritual technology. Reverberant spaces blur sound, prolong it, braid it into overlapping waves. Chant in a resonant hall and room sings back, creating a sonic envelope that can feel larger than the self. That can produce awe, quiet, and sometimes a mild altered state, especially with repetitive rhythms. Engineers measure this now as impulse responses, clarity indices, and decay times. Religious builders experienced it as the voice of the temple itself. Domes can distribute sound outward smoothly. Some spaces create focal points where voices carry with uncanny presence. The behavioral consequence is real. People naturally speak more softly and move more carefully in echoing halls. Architecture subtly enforces reverence. And neuroscience more broadly supports the foundation. Rhythmic sound and collective chanting can entrain attention and synchronize timing across groups, increasing cohesion and supporting meditative states. Now a little bit about fractals, ornament, and biophilic design. This is where modern science becomes almost startlingly relevant to sacred geometry. A strong research lane suggests that fractal patterns, self-similar structures repeating across scales like coastlines, trees, clouds, can reduce stress responses. Natural environments often exhibit fractal dimensions in a mid-range sweet spot, and studies linked to Richard Taylor's work report that viewing fractal patterns in the approximate D13 to 15 range can significantly improve stress recovery as measured through psychological indicators like skin conductance, sometimes reported as reductions on the order of 60% in certain experimental contexts. Now look back at sacred ornament, Islamic geometric tiling, Gothic tracery, rose windows, mucronus vaults, Hindu towers covered in repeated niches. Much of it is fractal-like across 2 to 3 scales, not rigidly repetitive, not chaotic, but predictably unpredictable. That kind of ordered complexity is exactly what the visual system seems to enjoy. Engaging enough to hold attention, coherent enough to feel safe. This overlaps with biophilic design, the idea that environments echoing nature improve well-being. Sacred spaces have been doing biophilia for millennia. Courtyards with gardens, column forests like groves, ceilings painted like starfields, water as sound and shimmer, ornament that mimics vegetal growth. Contemporary researchers studying urban experience and well-being have argued for reintegrating fractal and nature-like design into built environment precisely because of its measurable benefits. Contemporary researchers studying urban experience and well-being have argued for reintegrating fractal and nature-like design into built environments precisely because of its measurable benefits. And light is one of the most powerful regulators we have. Certain wavelengths influence circadian rhythms and hormone cycles. Directionality shapes attention. Contrast creates drama. Sacred architecture uses light the way music uses silence, as a guided revelation. Stained glass doesn't only tell stories, it changes the emotional temperature of the air. A shaft of sunrise light hitting an altar is not just symbolism. It's attentional engineering. It creates a moment the old scholars would call hierophany, a manifestation of the sacred, through geometry, orientation, and timing, interacting with neurobiology, vision, arousal, and emotion. From a cognitive science perspective, geometric order is rewarding partly because it delivers meaningful structure. Symmetry, rhythm, axial plans, concentric layouts, these help participants organize experience. Ritual spaces with clear axes and centers reduce navigational uncertainty, making it easier for attention to settle and for symbolism to land. But there's an important caution. Not every geometric overlay is meaningful. Some claims about hidden alignments collapse into pattern finding without cultural anchoring or functional reality. The difference is whether geometry is embedded in tradition and practice, processions, solstice alignments, directional liturgy, or whether it's imposed after the fact as speculation. When it is anchored, when an alignment hits a sacred point at a precise time, or when a processional path encodes theology, its impact can be profound because it's happening in the world and in the body simultaneously. Finally, we can't reduce sacred space to vision alone. Sacred architecture choreographs bodies, processional naves, circumambulation routes, stair ascents, spiral climbs, and threshold crossings. Anthropologists and architectural theorists have long emphasized that ritual meaning is enacted through movement. Space is not just perceived, it is performed. Climbing a tower, circling a relic, walking a spiral path, these are not mere metaphors. They are embodied scripts that can induce altered attention through rhythm, breath, exertion, and expanding view, exactly the conditions known to shift eternal state. In short, modern science doesn't diminish the magic. For many people, it deepens it. We are wired so that certain geometries and spaces can dial mental states towards calm, awe, focus, and communion. Medieval builders didn't speak of cortisol or neural oscillations, but they observed effects, refined them, and preserved them in tradition. Today, we can imagine future sacred or secular contemplative spaces engineered with deliberate precision, fractal light, acoustic resonance tuned for chant, labyrinth walking paths designed for parasympathetic activation, yet, in a sense, this is simply the modern language for what temples, gardens, bells, domes, and stained glass have been doing all along. Scholars in art, religious studies, and anthropology continue to parse the symbolic function of geometry in sacred buildings. For example, historian Keith Critchlow studied Islamic patterns and found them to be both analytical and cosmological. The act of constructing them by hand could be a form of meditation on the underlying order of the universe. In theological geometry, scholars consider how concept of God as perfect or immutable often translate into architectural tropes, the immovable center, the perfect circle, and so on. Anthropologist Mircea Eliade argued that sacred space is breakthrough space. It breaks the homogeneity of profane space by being ordered in reference to a fixed point, the axis mundi. That resonates with the geometry we've seen. An axis or center is almost always present: fire altars, temples, megaliths, anchoring the cardinal directions and the human community around it. John Z. Smith noted that even in secular contexts, humans like to construct centers for orientation, a behavior that has ancient religious roots. From a psychological angle, Carl Jung spoke of the mandala as an archetype of wholeness. Interestingly, when patients drew mandalas, it often signified the psyche's attempt to self-heal by finding order. Jung observed the mandala motifs spontaneously appear in dreams or art of people under stress or during individuation, personal growth. Many religions externalize mandalas in their architecture, the stupa, the rose window, and so on, essentially providing a collective psyche with an image of wholeness. Jung even said the modern city lacks a sacred center contributing to fragmentation. He admired cities with a central cathedral or square, a geometric center, as giving a psychological anchor to inhabitants. Finally, there is emerging research in environmental psychology and spiritual well-being. For instance, Robert Urwick's famous 1984 study found that hospital patients with views of nature recover faster than those with a wall view. Extrapolating, a sacred building that incorporates natural patterns like fractals, natural light, plants, and courtyards might foster healing or spiritual comfort more effectively. Today, architects designing worship spaces, like churches and meditation centers, sometimes collaborate with acousticians, light experts, and psychologists to optimize serenity or awe. They are, in effect, doing knowingly what ancient builders did by rule of thumb or tradition. Consider also acoustics. Gothic cathedrals with their high vaults and reflective stone create long reverberation, making music, chant, or organ echo ethereally. Gothic cathedrals with their high vaults and reflective stone create long reverberation, making music, chant, or organ echo ethereally, which can give worshippers goosebumps, a sensation linked to elevated emotion and even transcendence. Some mosques have mirabolic domes that project the imam's voice clearly. Thus, geometry not only shapes light and view, but sound, which deeply affects mood. Sacred architecture works not by magic, but by very earthly means. By engaging our senses, bodies, and social cognition in a coordinated, often highly sophisticated way. The ancients and religious masters, through trial, intuition, or inspiration, figured out effective formulas, whether it's the golden ratio for beauty, or aligning to solstice for awe, or echo patterns for a sense of presence. The ancients and religious masters, through trial, intuition, or inspiration, figured out effective formulas, whether it's the golden ratio for beauty, or aligning to solstice for awe, or echo patterns for a sense of presence. Modern science is only now catching up to quantify and explain these effects. However, we should also recognize that while geometry can predispose certain feelings, the cultural and individual context matters hugely. A person who knows the symbolism of a church's cruciform shape may feel deeper resonance than someone who doesn't. A devotee might get comfort from the familiarity of their tradition's sacred forms. So the meaning-making element is vital. Geometry is the vessel. Meaning is poured into it by culture. As scholar Lindsay Jones put it, ritual architecture is a stage for the performance of meaning, and its shapes are like the script. In conclusion, the union of sacred geometry and architecture is a testament to humanity's enduring effort to bring the heavens down to earth, or to lift earth up to the heavens by means of proportion, pattern, and alignment. From the mud brick ziggurats and stone circles of prehistory to digital parametric designs from modern temples that optimize light and sound, the story arc is one of using geometry as a kind of silent liturgy, a mode of prayer and connection in built form. And that leaves us with the final, beautiful ambiguity. The skeptic says it's just brain chemistry. The mystic replies, if humans respond so perfectly to sanctuaries, maybe that wiring is part of the design. Either way, the resonance between our internal architecture and sacred geometry is real, and it is one of the most compelling bridges between ancient intuition and modern evidence. After this long journey, let's step back and synthesize. What are sacred buildings actually doing to align humans with something larger? Are they really gateways to the divine, or just clearly engineered mood setters tapping into human psychology? As religious tech, we can see sacred spaces as a technology of worship. They are stage sets for myth and ritual that make the intangible tangible. A stone circle frames the rising sun so people tangibly see the moment of solstice, transforming an abstract idea of rebirth into a direct experience. A cathedral's cruciform layout literally crucifies space. You walk the shape of the cross, embodying theology. These buildings often align with myths and cosmologies. Pyramids as resurrection machines pointing to stars of afterlife, mandalas as solid prayers of universal harmony, churches oriented to the Easter sunrise. By physically orienting and shaping experience, they reinforce belief. One can say they act as reality distortion fields where the normal world is reframed by sacred narrative. Inside, you're in the cosmos, you're on the holy ground, you're in contact with the gods or saints. As social tech, sacred architecture organizes bodies and communities. Think of the egalitarian rows in a mosque. It reinforces the Ummah's equality. No special pews, all on the floor facing Qibla. Hindu temple layouts often lead devotees in circumambulation around the sanctum, a choreography of devotion that also manages crowd flow elegantly. Medieval cathedrals served civic pride and economic draw. Pilgrims equal business. Their bell towers were communication tools ringing out events. So these spaces also encoded power structures. Who gets to stand where, thus reinforcing hierarchy or in some cases, challenging it. Open revivalist meeting tents did away with church hierarchy physically. On grand scales, city planning with sacred accesses legitimizes political authority via cosmic order. The emperor's palace on the pole of the world, every street aligned to that grid. Thus, architecture physically socializes individuals. Your process in as an initiate or pilgrim. Follow the lines, kneel, and so on. The memory of festival gatherings in a huge plaza, like St. Peter's Rome embracing colonnades, can instill collective identity. It's social engineering through space. As neurotech, we've discussed how architecture can induce awe, calm, perhaps even spiritual euphoria. Awe in particular is interesting. Studies suggest awe, often triggered by vast spaces like canyons or cathedrals, increase feelings of connection and diminishes focus on the self. That is exactly what many religious experiences aim for, to dissolve the ego into a larger whole, God or community. So a skeptic could say a cathedral is basically a machine to generate awe by exploiting size, light, and sound, a God simulator, making you feel small and receptive. The believer might respond, yes, and that feeling of presence you got, that was God or at least an opening to God. Either way, the architecture is doing something to brain and behavior. Lowering stress, increasing suggestibility, perhaps when calm and awe-struck, one is more open to messages, aiding memory of the sacred stories, stained glass for the illiterate was an early form of visual sermon. People likely remembered biblical scenes by associating them with window locations. Spatial memory aiding catechesis. To strongly argue for the spiritual perspective, it's possible these refined techniques tune us to beneficial states that believers interpret as transcendent. Perhaps sacred geometry works not by any external magic, but by unlocking our own deeper mental potentials, like moving from beta wave daily chatter to alpha or theta wave meditative insight. Many mystics say the kingdom of God is within. Architecture may just help turn the key. Like consistent cross-cultural similarities, like many traditions found that dim-colored light and echoing chants lead to visions or peace, hint that they were independently discovering the same human truth, that our consciousness can be shifted by shaping our environment. Everything we've described can be explained by psychology and culture. We feel awe because we're small in a big space, and culture taught us to associate big churches with God. We feel calm in a Zen garden due to evolved preferences for safe landscapes, and our mirror neurons quiet down because we sense intentional, quiet design. There's no objective divine force entering the building. The building is affecting our hormones and neural firing. That's it. And often those in power use these effects to bolster their control, awe of king and God intertwined. So a skeptic might say sacred architecture is the earliest form of effective engineering. Like how today theme parks or casinos are designed for emotional impact, casinos ironically use the opposite, disorientating layouts to confuse you. Churches use orienting layouts to focus you. In short, architects learn to manipulate human emotions to serve religion's growth. Both views can coexist, actually. One can appreciate the craft and effect while still holding personal belief that in those moments of awe or peace, one touches something numinous. Or one could be non-religious, yet still go into cathedrals or mosques to use their beauty for personal meditation, a testament that regardless of belief, these environments have value for human well-being. Indeed, many secular mindfulness centers now incorporate sacred design elements, like labyrinth walks and hospitals for stress relief. We've toured Egyptian pyramids, Greek temples, Gothic cathedrals, Islamic mosaics, Hindu mandalas, and more, noting the recurrent theme that geometry is seen as divine order materialized. We've listened to Renaissance sages and modern scientists who across centuries agree that there is something inherently impactful about the right proportions and patterns. The lecture could continue touching on feng shui and Chinese architecture, balancing energies via spatial geometry, or how modern city grids versus organic medieval streets affect us. But by now, one thing is clear. When architecture engages sacred geometry, it transcends mere building. It becomes a story of the universe told in shape and line. Each pillar and arc speaks of the axis of the world, the cycle of time, the number harmony of creation. Each step a pilgrim takes along a processional way or labyrinth is both a physical act and a journey through a symbolic cosmos. In such spaces, we often feel an uncanny calm or elevation, not by accident but by design. The designers, whether they credit Tahuti or God Almighty or cosmic evolution, they have tuned their structures like instruments to play chords that our body and soul can hear. And when those chords resonate, we stand in a sacred space where the geometry around us, the rituals performed, and our own inner world come into alignment. At that moment, sunlight hitting the sanctum, chant echoing in the dome, eyes tracing the ornate patterns, we experience what all the theory boils down to: a sense of connection, of meaning, of something sacred beyond the ordinary. Geometry, in the end, is one of the languages of the sacred, and architecture is its enduring poetry, written across the globe in stone, brick, and light, inviting us into a deeper harmony with the cosmos and ourselves. And that is the end of another Occult Rejects, and I hope you all enjoyed. Until the next one.